So Zephaniah. Zephaniah verse 1 sets him apart from the other prophets we're going to be considering this weekend, because we are given some ancestry. And you might look at that and think, well, so what? What's so important about that? If we look at it in another version, virtually any other version, we actually see that Hezekiah is mentioned. So it may well be that Zephaniah was the great-great-grandson of Hezekiah. And we see that he prophesied in the days of Josiah. So if this is the case, he may well have been, in fact, a distant relative of Josiah's. If we have a look at this timeline, we can see from the start of Hezekiah's reign there to the start of Josiah's reign there, there's a period of 76 years. So it is quite possible that Hezekiah was in fact, the Hezekiah mentioned there was in fact King Hezekiah. And they would have had to have had children at a relatively young age, maybe 20 or so, but it does fit. And it just seems to me that the very fact that we're given a list of ancestors in that first verse was specifically to let us know that Zephaniah was part of the royal family. Now, when we think about King Josiah, we think about a good king. He was a king who tried to, follow God's laws. Now, we're told that Zephaniah was prophesying during Josiah's reign, but Zephaniah's prophecy was anything but complimentary. So we might think, well, what's going on here? Josiah's a good king, but Zephaniah's message was negative. Well, if we look at 2 Chronicles chapter 34, we find that Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. And it was only in the 8th year of his reign, when he was 16, that he began to serve God. And in the 12th year of his reign, he started breaking down the high places of idol worship. Now, the major message in Zephaniah is about the idolatry of the people of Judah. So it seems likely that Zephaniah prophesied somewhere between 639 to 631 BC. And, obviously dates are a bit rubbery, but the idea being that he was prophesying during the period leading up to Josiah starting to reform the ways of Judah. There's a lot of similarities between the dire warnings that Zephaniah gives to the prophecy of Joel. And Joel prophesied to the 10 tribes of Israel about 150 years earlier. So if we have just a bit of a look at a comparison between a couple of sections. So from Joel chapter 2, verse 2, we read, "A day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like the morning clouds spread over the mountains. A people come, great and strong, the like of whom has never been, nor will there ever be any such after them." And then compare that with Zephaniah's message 150 years later. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of devastation and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities and against the high towers. So I think you can see quite a bit of similarity in those two messages. And the point that I'm trying to make here is Judah appeared to have learnt nothing from the 10 tribes being carried away only 150 years earlier. I mean, they would be well aware of it, having been passed down, by word of mouth through the years. They sinned against God. They were taken away by Assyria. And here we are 150 years later, almost exactly the same thing being prophesied. Sin nature is a powerful thing, so easy to forget. And here's a warning for us as well. We can know in our heart that something's not right, but sin nature can so easily sort of overwhelm that, put it aside, and before you know it, we're on the wrong path. So there's a little message for us. What I want to do now is show a video. It's the Bible Project video, which I think in this case is quite a good overview of the prophecy. And it's about, I think, 5 minutes long or something. So we'll just get that going.
The book of the prophet Zephaniah. Zephaniah lived during the final decades of the southern kingdom of Judah. It was when King Josiah had attempted to bring about real change in the land by removing idols and restoring the temple to the worship of Israel's God alone. But Israel was just too far gone. Worshipping other gods was too entrenched in the life of the people, and it ended up that Josiah's pride led him to a tragic death on the battlefield as he set Jerusalem on a collision course with Babylon. And Zephaniah, he had seen all of this coming. For years, he had been warning the leaders of Jerusalem. And this little book is a collection of his poetry summarizing his message. It's designed to have three main parts. The first focuses on the day of the Lord's judgment coming on Judah and Jerusalem. The second part is about the day of the Lord's judgment on the nations and Jerusalem again. And then the third section explores the hope that remains for the nations and for Jerusalem on the other side of God's judgment. The first section opens with the shocking reversal of Genesis 1. So God's good, ordered world is going to descend back into disorder and darkness and chaos, becoming uninhabitable once again. And as you keep reading, you realize Zephaniah is developing all of these powerful poetic images to describe how Jerusalem's world is going to end. All of the city's institutions for worshiping the gods of the Canaanites will be destroyed. All the leaders who perpetrated injustice, all the economic centers where crooked lending and borrowing took place, all of it will be gone along with the city's walls. Zephaniah develops these almost apocalyptic images to show the significance of what's going to happen. It all refers to a great army that is coming to take out Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting that Zephaniah never mentions whose army God's going to use to bring this judgment. Now, we know from the other prophets, Micah or Habakkuk, that it's Babylon, but Zephaniah never mentions that, and it's because he wants to highlight God's role in orchestrating the rise and fall of the city. And actually, that's what gives Zephaniah hope. Not that Jerusalem as a whole can avoid its fate, but in the closing poem of section 1, he calls on anyone in Jerusalem who would seek the Lord. And he says these will make up the faithful remnant, the people who could be spared if they repent. In the second section, Zephaniah widens his focus to include the nations around Judah. So the Philistines or Moabites, the Ammonites, even the Assyrians. He accuses all of them of corruption and violence and arrogance, and he predicts that all of them will fall before Babylon too. And what's shocking is that the final people group targeted in this section are the Israelites in Jerusalem. It's like the leaders and prophets and priests of Israel are so corrupt and violent, so estranged from their God, that he doesn't even recognize them as his people anymore. And so this section ends with God's final decision. He says he's going to gather up all the nations, including Jerusalem, and pour out his burning indignation. God's justice becomes this consuming fire that devours evil from the land, which is really intense. And so the following line that brings us into the final part of the book comes as a total surprise. We discover that this burning fire of divine judgment is not aimed at destroying people. Rather, its purpose is to purify the nations, including Jerusalem. So the section begins as God says that he's going to heal and transform the rebellious nations into one unified family. and that after being purified, they're going to turn from their evil and call upon the name of the Lord. These images point to the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, all the way back in Genesis 12, that God would find a way to bless the nations, and Jerusalem as well. The conclusion of the book focuses on the restoration of the city at the center of the nations. God's presence is there in the restored city, along with that faithful remnant that's been humbled and transformed by God's mercy. And they're called to sing and rejoice. And then in this striking image, we're told that God is a poet who wants to sing too. Your God will live among you, and he will celebrate you with songs of joy, Zephaniah says. The closing poem of the book ends with these very powerful images about God gathering up into his family the outcast and the poor and the broken, where he exalts them into a place of honor. And that's how the book ends. This little book of Zephaniah, it contains some of the most intense images of God's justice and love that you find anywhere in the prophets. His justice is about his passion to protect and to rescue his world from the horror of human evil and violence. God won't tolerate the horrible things that humans do to each other and to his world. But he brings his justice in order to restore, in order to create a world where people can flourish in safety and peace because of his love. And so Zephaniah forces us to hold together these two aspects of God's character, his justice and his love. And he wants us to discover that together they contain the future hope of our world. And that's what the book of Zephaniah is all about.
Okay, so I thought that was a pretty good overview of the prophecy. A couple of things there that I think are quite ironic. He talked about this coming host that we're going to overthrow Judah. Now, again, by word of mouth, the people would have been aware that in Hezekiah's day, God saved them from Assyria. Remember the 185,000 that were slain overnight? But that was because they were serving God. And yet here they are in the same situation as the 10 tribes, about to be smashed by another host coming through, and they weren't prepared to turn to God. You might also notice that he talked there about poetic language. So it's not poems like we think of poems of rhyming words. It's, creating pictures, word pictures, to emphasise a point. From here, I'm going to pick out parts of Zephaniah that I felt needed a little bit more explanation or were interesting. So if you're interested enough to have Zephaniah open, you'll be able to sort of see where I'm going. So in terms of this poetic language that I mentioned, verses 2 and 3 of chapter 1 speak about God destroying everything from off the face of the earth, sweeping everything away. And this sounds quite a bit like the flood. But as we know, God is not going to use that form of destruction again. But he is going to sweep away all wickedness from the earth. And it was both in Judah's day, in Zephaniah's time, but also, as we know, into the future. And I was reminded of that sort of imagery of the prophecy of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar's image, where the stone comes down and smashes the feet of iron and clay and brings the image down, but it doesn't stop there. It actually goes on to say that the image is ground to powder and just blown away in the wind. And it's imagery describing the end of man's rule. The end of all wickedness, the end of man's rule, and God, taking over control. And I think if we look at verse 3, In the King James we read, I will consume man and beast, I will consume the fowls of the heaven and the fishes of the sea, and the stumbling blocks with the wicked. I think the NIV makes it a little bit clearer there what that means. I will sweep away both man and beast, I will sweep away the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea, and the idols that cause the wicked to stumble. Because it was, in Zephaniah's day, it was the idols, the worship of other gods, that was so wicked in God's eyes. And I guess on an occasion like this, where we're all together in peace and quietness, separated from our daily lives, it's a really good time for us to have a little bit of self-examination and just think, do we have any idols? And of course, I'm not talking about, little figurines that we worship. I'm talking about things in the world, distractions in the world that can take us away from God. Things like, it could be a job, it could be a house, it could be a car, it could be a garden, a whole range of things. If they're, becoming a priority in our lives, then they're becoming an idol. And if we look at verses 4 to 6 of this chapter as well, we see that Zephaniah is describing 3 types of sinner. There were those who openly were worshipping other gods. There were those who were worshipping other gods, but also Yahweh too. So a bit of a mixed bag. And then there were those who weren't religious at all. So 3 categories. And we live in an increasingly atheistic world, don't we? The last census that was taken in Australia, the number of people who nominated no religion at all has almost grown to 50%, which is the highest it's ever been. And many of those people are incredibly scornful and rude towards believers and towards God himself. The lesson here for us, brothers and sisters, is not to be like the divided believers, the ones who believe in God but also believe in other things. It's coming back to that whole idea of idols and priorities. And it really is a good occasion here where we're together, where we can sort of strengthen each other and make sure in our own minds that our priorities are right. In verse 8, it says that God would punish those who dressed in foreign clothes. We might ask the question, why would that be the case? Well, it seems likely that the priests who are referred to in verse 4 had moved away from the clothing specified for them to wear by God back in Numbers 15 to wearing showier, colourful clothing that was used by the worshippers of false gods. And we see an example here from Ezekiel 23. But she carried her prostitution still further. She saw men portrayed on a wall, figures of Chaldeans portrayed in red with belts around their waists and flowing turbans on their heads. All of them looked like Babylonian chariot officers, natives of Chaldea. So it appears that they were following in the footsteps of the nations around them and changing what God had commanded in terms of how they dressed and obviously how they worshipped. We can see in the world around us some examples of extreme clothing and imagery in some of the churches, can't we? Now in verse 9, why would God punish those who leap upon the threshold? In the same day also will I punish all those that leap on the threshold, which fill their masters' houses with violence and deceit. I think maybe a better translation of that verse is this one. On that day I will punish all who avoid stepping on the threshold. Now this seems to have been a superstitious practice, and it harked back to something that God did to the Philistines. You might remember the story from 1 Samuel chapter 5. When the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they placed it in the temple of their god Dagon. And the next morning when they came in, the image of Dagon had fallen down before the ark. So the Philistines put it back up. And the next morning they came in, this is what they found. There was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark before the ark of the Lord. His head and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. That is why to this day neither the priests of Dagon nor any others who entered Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on the threshold. So they would sort of walk to the door and take a little jump through the door. And it seems like that superstitious practice had been carried right through to this time of Zephaniah, and the children of Judah were copying that practice. And the ironic thing is, and the sad part about it is, that God was the one who had demonstrated his power over the false god and caused this superstitious behaviour, and instead of turning to the true God, the children of Judah were turning to the false gods. Now verse 12 caught my eye. It says there, the Lord, this is what the people thought, the Lord will do nothing, either good or bad. And how much does that remind us of today? People can't see God, so they don't believe in him. And in fact, have come up with all sorts of theories to avoid the idea that God exists. It's a lesson for us to remember too. Even though we can't see God, he requires our faith, doesn't he? And always for us to remember that God is working out his plan in the background, even if we can't physically see the angels. They're bringing about God's will. And I'm sure all of us at one time or another in our lives have felt like we have had the presence of God, protecting us or looking after us one way or another. I'm sure all of us have had that experience. The final point I wanted to bring out from chapter 1 is verse 18. Neither their silver or their gold will be able to save them on the day of the Lord's wrath. The pursuit of wealth and possessions continues to be a goal right through history to today, and it can affect us to the detriment of our service too, if we're not careful. Chapter 2 commences with an appeal to the Israelites to humble themselves and turn to God. And this is just as applicable, obviously, today as it was all those years ago, because human nature naturally tends towards being proud. And so we have this verse here that I love from 1 Peter 5. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Pride can take many forms. From King Nebuchadnezzar striding around, his palace and saying, look at what I've created here, right through to Jacob always trying to control things himself rather than thinking that God would help out. And sometimes, brothers and sisters, and I need to learn this lesson as much as anybody, we have to try to remember that God is in control. We have to let go sometimes and say, I can't sort this out, it's in God's hands. And that's one of the aspects of pride that we all need to be aware of. If we look at verse 3 of Zephaniah 2, I think a better translation for the word hid is sheltered. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, you who do what he commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. God will shelter or protect the meek from the judgments to come. And that's interesting because the name Zephaniah actually means God has hidden. And not in the sense of hiding something away, but in the sense of putting something in a safe place. Sheltered. And God was saying he would shelter all those who turn to him, and we can see here a type of Christ. Because all those who have put on Christ have become part of God's family and are therefore under his protection, under his shelter. Now the rest of Zephaniah chapter 2 is about judgments against nations who had persecuted Judah and Israel, even if they'd been carrying out God's will. So the Philistines, the Moabites, Ammonites and Egyptians, who are referred to here as the Ethiopians, all of these are going to be punished. And finally, we get to the Assyrians, and in particular, their capital city of Nineveh. God decreed that this great city was to be destroyed and become a ruin, inhabited only by wild animals, and it was to be forever. Now that's a long time. And it would be easy for someone to point out that God's Bible, God's word, had not been true if Nineveh was rebuilt, for example. In 612 BC, Nineveh was captured and destroyed by a coalition of the Babylonians and the Medes. And if Zephaniah was indeed a descendant of Hezekiah, he would have been a relatively young man when he prophesied, perhaps in his early 20s. And given that Nineveh was destroyed around 20 years after his prophecy, he may well have been alive to see that prophecy fulfilled. That's Nineveh today, the ancient site of Nineveh. Exactly as prophesied. And interestingly too, if we think about Zephaniah being a royal descendant, he may have actually been taken away to Babylon with Daniel in around 605 BC. He may have still been alive at that point. He might have been in his 50s or something. So all of these things that he prophesied about, he may well have lived through. Chapter 3 begins with another rebuke to Judah. God talks about all the things that he'd done to protect and to punish Judah, to try and bring them back to him. And he says in verse 7, which is the end of this section, I thought, this is God speaking, surely they will have reverence for me now. Surely they will listen to my warnings. Then I won't need to strike again, destroying their homes. But no, they get up early to continue their evil deeds. So the rest of this chapter is actually future to us. It's interesting because there was a prophecy to be fulfilled in Zephaniah's time, but there's also a prophecy still to be fulfilled, a time we're looking forward to. And the rest of this chapter talks about a gathering of the nations for a final cleansing. And it reinforces the prophecies that we all, I'm sure, think about from time to time, from Zechariah, from Ezekiel 38 and 39, and Revelation, about that final decisive battle that is to come. And after that, we get to the kingdom age and a reconciliation between God and man. And in Zephaniah 3 verse 9, we read, "For then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord, to serve him with one consent." Now, we often use this verse to speculate that in the kingdom age, the mortal population will actually return to one language, similar to how it was back in Genesis. And the thought has been expressed that it'll possibly be the Hebrew language. And look, that may be so, but I actually think the emphasis here is on the word pure. The world population needs to be taught the truth so they can serve God with one accord. Just think about how many variations there are on the truth in the world today. It's ridiculous. The number of different ideas about, even if you believe in God, even if you're a Christian, the number of different ideas, they can't serve God in purity until all of that's sorted out. The Hebrew word translated as consent in the King James Version literally means shoulder, of all things, a shoulder. And it's giving the idea about working together shoulder to shoulder, not being unequally yoked, as Paul talked about. If everyone knows the one truth and they're walking in the one direction, they're going shoulder to shoulder, then they can worship God in purity. And that's what he wants. So all of these things, all of these, different doctrines and different beliefs have got to be sorted out. And that, hopefully, brothers and sisters, is going to be our job. To actually teach the people in the world, the mortals, what the real truth is. So, to me, not so much emphasis on a single language, but more emphasis on a single set of beliefs. Verses 11 to 13 talk of one final purging against Judah, against Israel. Now, there was the Babylonians to take them away in Zephaniah's time, but we know there is also to be another final and rather horrible purging of the people of Israel. They are going to be severely punished. And I think most of us are pro-Israel because, they're God's people. And that's true. But at this moment in time, they are very wicked in God's eyes. Many Jews are atheists, living proud and worldly lives. For example, Tel Aviv is known as the gay capital of the Middle East. Of the Jews who are religious, most of them don't acknowledge that Jesus was the Son of God. So there needs to be a massive change of heart. And that's going to be brought about by this final terrible punishment on Israel. But as so many of these prophecies do, we end on a positive note. The rest of the chapter is a beautiful, beautiful picture of God finally reconciled to his people. In verse 17 of Zephaniah 3, we read, "The Lord your God in your midst, the mighty one, will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing." And if you've ever wondered why we sing hymns, here's a verse using the analogy of singing by God to show his love for his people. So, clearly it can go the other way. We can sing to God to show our love for him. And in fact, we read it in today's reading from Ephesians 5 verse 19, where Paul talked about, singing praise to God with thankfulness in our hearts. So we have a final regathering of the Jews from all over the world, and at last recognition from the entire world population that they are indeed God's chosen people and as such worthy of praise themselves. Verse 20, "At that time I will gather you, at that time I will bring you home. I will give you honour and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes before your very eyes, says the Lord." And that closing verse of Zephaniah reminds me of this one from Zechariah. Zechariah 8 verse 23. "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all languages of the nations, even shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, We will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you." So we see in this short prophecy, 3 chapters, an overview of God's total plan for his people, and God willing for us too. A whole lot of hope for us to look forward to.